David Rattray, who has listened to Zulu stories about the war and lived on the borders of Zululand for 10 years, examines the documents surrounding Rorke's drift and the events leading up to it.
I think it can be said that the Anglo-Zulu War is one of the most famous colonial campaigns that anyone ever fought anywhere. I wonder if there's a British person alive who has not heard of the Battle of Rorke's Drift. You know, it was the most unlikely battle with the most unlikely outcome. This little handful of British soldiers holds out all night against this impossible attack by 4,500 Zulus. And indeed, the movie Zulu was inspired by Rorke's Drift, and it's a fantastic movie.
In the 100 years since the Victoria Cross was created for valor and extreme courage, beyond that normally expected of a British soldier in face of the enemy, only 1,344 have been awarded. 11 of these were won by the defenders of the mission station at Rorke's Drift, Natal, January 22nd to the 23rd, 1879. Henry Hook, Private, B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Foot. James Henry Reynolds, Surgeon Major, Army Hospital Corps. Gonville Bromhead, Lieutenant, B Company, 2nd Battalion of the 24th Regiment of Foot, South Wales Borderers. John Rouse Marriott Chard, Lieutenant, Royal Engineers, Officer Commanding, Rorke.
It is a remarkable day, the 22nd of January, 1879. The Battle of Rorke's Drift in the afternoon, and the Battle of Isandlwana during the morning and the midday period, which is today becoming a very famous battle. But it was overlooked, I think, for a long time. There's this cataclysmic defeat for Britain in the morning, and there's victory in the afternoon. What a wonderful balance there is on the day. The Battle of Isandlwana, then that night, the Battle of Rorke's Drift. 14 Victoria Crosses awarded in one day, and at Rorke's Drift, 11, the greatest number of VCs ever awarded for a single action in history. But I'm not an historian. I'm a zoologist. But I have an academic interest in history now, and I have an enormous library. And the Zulu War is one of the most documented conflicts on record, certainly from this whole period of Victorian history. Huge libraries exist. Volumes were written. Letters abound. And yet, one is left struck with how little we know from the Zulu point of view. It's not a simple story, and there are no angels in the story. The Zulus were perceived by the British colonial authority here to constitute a threat to Lord Carnarvon's plan for the confederation of this country. And therefore an ultimatum was issued to the Zulus that the Zulus would have to disband their army. And if they failed to do it, it was the British intention to come and disband it for them. The ultimatum was issued without the sanction of the central British government. And so this whole thing happens without central approval. The Zulus, for various good reasons, didn't see fit to answer the terms of the ultimatum, so the invasion takes place. And Lord Chelmsford, in command of Her Majesty's forces, had hoped to present the new colonial secretary, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, with a fait accompli that the Zulus had been smashed. And the Zulus went from the most powerful nation in the sub-region to being a nation which was just another race of black people living in southern Africa. And yet the Zulus have retained an enormous amount of their dignity. And when you listen to these people telling stories about who they are, what they believe they did, and what they're capable of doing, one is left in awe of them. We're standing at Rorke's Drift on the Buffalo River. And over this stretch, the buffalo used to constitute the border between the British colony of Natal and the Kingdom of Zululand. This river, which has hitherto been a slow, meandering stream, starts to cut its way into the Great Gorge. And its first move is to slide over a great slab of rock, a magnificent natural causeway. That is a drift. And that's why all this happened here. It's an obscure little mission station. It features in history. It was the site of the trading post of James Rorke, after whom it's named. And it was indeed the site of the great Battle of Rorke's Drift. Real boys' own stuff. A great wing of the Zulu army, which had not been in action during the course of the fight at Isandlwana, contrary to the orders of the King Cetshwayo, crossed the Buffalo River into Natal and attacked the little British garrison at Rorke's Drift. 139 British soldiers, 35 of whom were sick and disabled. The warriors, there were about 4,500 of them, attacked repeatedly through the night. The British had brilliantly fortified that mission station using biscuit boxes and mealie bags, and they held out all night against this fantastic attack. But every Zulu that I've ever interviewed on this piece of history has dismissed Rorke's Drift. That was merely a story of a few warriors that disobeyed the orders of the king, and they went with their spears and they crossed the Buffalo River and they went and dug little bits out of the house of old Jimo. James Rorke, who'd never done us Zulus any harm, and they got thumped. Well, that's the way the cookie crumbles. The impi that attacked Rorke's Drift was the right horn of the Zulu army, and that right horn of the Zulu army at Isandlwana had not really been in much of the action.
When we go out to attack somebody, we put some poison, something poisonous in the tip of the spear.
Kenneth Buthelezi is the curator at Isandlwana, collector and guardian of Zulu oral history.
So we must stab somebody before we return back. So if we come back having not killed anyone, we bring back a bad spirit.
And the washing of the spears, the bathing of the assegai in the blood of the enemy, and this was really an essential prerequisite before one was allowed to don the head ring and get married. The warriors in the right horn at Isandlwana, who never really got into the thick of the fight, were no doubt deeply conscious that their counterparts in the center and chest of the Zulu army at Isandlwana were having an absolute field day assegai washing. And so they put pressure on their chieftain, Dablamanzi Gampande, the king's half-brother, and he acquiesced. He let them cross, and they crossed. And I think that there's a lot of the washing of the spears in the story of Rorke's Drift, so to speak. I went to Brecon to talk to the curator there, Major Martin Everett, who has access to original letters.
I'm the curator of the Southwest Borders Museum in Brecon, and of course the Southwest Borders were known around the world for their involvement in the Zulu Wars of 1879. We've now put together details of almost every defender of Rorke's Drift. This is Henry Hooks here, Hook the cook. He was one of those soldiers who was getting the injured out of the hospital, and it was quite a desperate thing. I mean, they had 26 soldiers to rescue, and they only had minutes to do it. And of course you had the cries of the Zulus, the fact that it was then on fire, and you've got burning timbers coming from the ceiling, and they did an absolutely marvellous job to save the sick and the injured.
The Zulus kept drawing closer and closer, and I went on firing, killing several of them. At last they got close up and set fire to the hospital. There was only one patient in my room with a broken leg. He was burnt. I was driven out by the flames and was unable to save him. Then John Williams came in from another room and made a hole in the partition, through which he helped the wounded man. Whilst he was doing this, the Zulus beat in the door. I stood at the side and shot and bayoneted several. I couldn't tell how many, but there were 4 or 5 lying dead at my feet. When all the patients were out, I also went through the hole. I then took my post behind the parapet where 3 men had been hit just before. On this side, the blaze of the hospital lighted up the ground in front, enabling us to take aim.
Obviously people like Colour Sergeant Bourne, again, would have been crucially involved in allocating men to their tasks and making sure that they had enough ammunition. Colour Sergeant Bourne was a young colour sergeant of 24. He'd been in the army 6 years. Now, to get to colour sergeant after 6 years, he was a high flyer. He is, I suppose, my favourite.
The Zulus had collected the rifles from the men they had killed at Isandlwana, so our own arms were used against us. There was hardly a man even wounded by an assegai, their principal weapon. I was moving about amongst them all the time, and not for one moment did they flinch. Privates Hook, R. Jones, W. Jones, and J. Williams were the last to leave, holding the door with a bayonet when all their ammunition was expended. The Victoria Cross was awarded to these men, and they fully deserved it. The attack lasted from 4:30 p.m. on the 22nd to 4 a.m. on the 23rd, and when daybreak occurred, the enemy was out of sight. There are two things which I think have made Rorke's Drift stand out so vividly all these years. The first, that it took place on the same day as the terrible massacre at Isandlwana, and the second, that Natal was saved from being overrun by a savage and victorious foe.
It's an irony, but people are starting to see the significance of Isandlwana as a pivotal event which shaped this country's history, South Africa's history. No one really knows what happened there. There were only 55 white men who lived to tell something of the tale of Isandlwana. But if the truth be told, it has to be stressed that those 55 white men really got going sometime before the battle did, which makes it very difficult to put the story together from the British point of view. The British set up camp at Isandlwana, and then Lord Chelmsford reacted to some incorrect information that the Zulus were way off in the southeast, and he split the column. And while he was away, a patrol strayed from Isandlwana up onto the Great Ngutu Plateau, and Lieutenant Charlie Raw stumbled in upon the Zulus lying in a great gully 5 miles from the camp. And the Zulus rose up. There were 25,000 Zulu warriors in that gully, and they emerged from that gully, and they loped across that great plain, the Ngutu Plateau, breaking up into their traditional tactic of the horns of the buffalo. And they surrounded that camp with the horns of the buffalo, and they completely and utterly destroyed it.
Yes, the horns of the buffalo is interesting because when the Zulus were discovered in their ravine, and only 3 miles from the British position...
Adrian Greaves of the Anglo-Zulu War Historical Society.
The Zulus had no intention of fighting on that day, and yet within 5 minutes of being discovered by Charlie Raw, they were on their feet and advancing over a line of 4.5 miles without radios, only using hand signals. It is impossible. I've tried it. I'm an ex-army officer on Salisbury Plain, and we'd get lost over more than 50, 60 yards. 1,000 soldiers firing volley after volley after volley at the massed ranks of the Zulus, and yet the Zulus managed it. And as they closed in on Isandlwana, their front was so wide that they actually managed to surround not only the British, but also the mountain which the British had to the back of them. So that when the British eventually started to collapse and the few survivors tried to flee, they just ran into the right horn of the Impi, or the Zulu army. But what many people don't know is the origins of the horn was a hunting tactic. And all they did, they adapted a hunting technique to their human enemies.
For too long we've been contemplating this battle as a British military defeat, and it was a brilliant military victory. And the victory belonged to Nchingwayo Gamahole Khoza, who is lucky to get one line in these 500-page volumes that have been written about this battle.
It's very difficult to say how it was that a Zulu army armed with spears could defeat a highly trained British invasion force. And they were highly trained. These soldiers had been there for the previous 6 years. I've discovered some very interesting letters and diaries, and they all have one thing in common. All commented on the fact that after the British had fired 1 or 2 volleys, that the rifles created so much smoke in front of them that they could not see. Yet there is no mention of this in any of the classical books about the Zulu War.
One can find a document which can support almost any theory. Such is the controversy.
There's controversies about the ammunition, there's controversy about the disposition of the camp, because nothing survives. A lot of the documents were actually lost on the battlefield.
Major Martin Everett.
What we have here is probably the most famous piece of paper in Wales today. The last message that was sent by Colonel Henry Pullein, who was commanding officer of the 1st 24th at Isandlwana, he addresses it to the staff officer at Chelmsford's headquarters, and it says, "A report has just come in that the Zulus are advancing in force from the left front of the camp." What is incredible, that the last message that was sent survived. Obviously, somebody tucked it in their pocket and brought it home with them.
But in the same breath, one wants to stress that there were 22,000 Zulus who survived the Battle of Isandlwana. And the story of that great fight lives on in many of the little villages of Zululand to this very day.
We were lying hidden in the hills up there when a party of some whites fired upon us. Then the whole regiment became very excited and sprang up. When the horsemen saw how many we were, they began to retreat. We formed up in a rank and marched towards the camp. At the top of the last hill, we were met by more horsemen, but we were too many for them and they retreated. Then the Ngomomakosi regiment, which formed the left horn of the regiment, extended and swept round on the south so as to outflank the soldiers, who fell back and took cover. Then furiously we all shouted, "Usutu!" and waving our shields, charged the soldiers. The Umchichu fell upon the soldiers, stabbing them with the asegas and driving them right in among the tents. Every warrior shouted, "Usutu!" as he killed anyone, and the sun got very dark like night.
It certainly didn't go dark like night. That's an exaggeration, but there was a 57% eclipse, I think it was. It started at 10 minutes past 1. It lasted until 10 minutes to 4. The computer gives us that information. And I think there's a fantastic symbolism in this eclipse. And it's in that the magic of this whole thing lies.
Our original left horn became the extreme right, while the right horn became the center, and the center the left horn. The two regiments made a turning along the front of the camp towards the English right, but became engaged long before they could accomplish it. We suffered greatly from the firing.
What many people don't know is that the Zulus had learnt that if they inclined their shields at 45 degrees to the British, because the Martini Henry rifle fired a round propelled by black powder, it had not got the velocity to penetrate a half-inch shield, and before they went into battle, they were told this by their witch doctors. Thousands and thousands of Zulus now, 200 yards from the British line, and they're given the order to charge. How long does it take an angry Zulu to run 200 yards?
We Zulus, we rose up. We rose up like a great black wave of the sea, and we fell upon them.
And it would have been over, as we know, in a matter of minutes.
A lot of them got up on the steep slopes under the cliff behind the camp, and we could not get at them at all. We were shot or bayoneted as fast as we came up. At last the soldiers gave a shout and charged down upon us. There was a captain in front of them with a flashing sword, which he whirled round his head as he ran. It must have been made of fire. Whee! They killed themselves by running down, for our people got above them and quite surrounded them. These were the last to fall.
"Ha," he said, "those red soldiers at Isandlwana. Like lions they fought, like stones they fell. Every man fell with a thud like a rock in his place." From a Zulu who watched that last stand of the British at Isandlwana.
When we at last took the camp, some pursued the fugitives down to the Buffalo River, and the rest plundered the camp, while the other regiments made their way to Rorke's Drift to attack the post there, in which they failed and lost very heavily, after fighting all the afternoon and night.
And there was a bishop called Mackenzie. He interviewed a Zulu called Mzwentu. Mzwentu, as a little boy, lived at Isandlwana, and he described how he and his friend Umdeni went to visit the battlefield and the horror that they experienced and how they ran away and how they came back again, and how Mzwentu frowned upon Umdeni because Umdeni ate a biscuit that was found on the battlefield. He thought it was appalling to eat a biscuit that might have been covered with another man's blood. And even in my lifetime, 10 years ago, there were still quite a few old men alive in our region whose fathers fought at Isandlwana. I had the most spellbinding afternoons with old man Ngobese sitting out at Isandlwana with my friend and confidant Mzonja Mpanza. And he gave us an enormous insight into Isandlwana. It was powerful stuff to listen to. A man whose father was a famous chieftain. It all had a sort of ring of absolute integrity.
My father fought at the battle, and they had reached the British firing line. The British firing was terrifying. They were firing into the packed masses of our warriors, and our warriors were starting to fall back. Then something happened which changed everything. My father said there was a loud cry above the roar of the battle. He said he watched as old man Mkosana of the BLA clan began to pick his way down through all those rocks and boulders towards the Zulu warriors who were falling back under the British fire. He was recklessly exposing himself to the firing. My father said he clearly heard the great cry above the firing and noise of the battle. Hey, you in front line!
Hey, nina lapaya, ninga balegi.
Don't even think of running away. Our king Wechwayo never ever gave you such an order. And with that, a British bullet struck him straight between the eyes, and he fell down dead in his tracks. And my father would weep as he told me. And we Zulus were so struck by this, so struck by what this old man had just done for us, that not one Zulu fell back even an inch.
No manage, even an inch. But in the moment of that great victory, that is Isandlwana, the Zulus really had sowed the seed of their demise. Cetshwayo, king of the Zulus, said of Isandlwana, he said, Sakwazwa. Sakwazwa siswini. We've had an assegai thrust deep into the belly of our nation. His creme de la creme, the Nkoba Makosi, the Umtricho, and the Umbonambi regiments had taken such enormous casualties that they would never ever fight properly again. And in that, indeed, their finest hour, the Zulus really had spent themselves as a military force forever. Then it became expedient for Disraeli's government to reinforce and reinvade and try and put this whole thing to bed quickly, before it got out of hand. But it did get out of hand. I mean, it enjoys a profile in the British press that has to be seen to be believed. You just got to flip through the pages of the Illustrated London News or the Graphic or the Evening Standard or any newspapers of this period. This, if ever there was a campaign that caught the eye of the British person at large, it was the Anglo-Zulu War. It is such a fantastic story. The tragedy of Cetshwayo being shipped to England to plead his case for repatriation from Queen Victoria. After visiting the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, this is in 1882, when they'd finished looking at all these inventions, and this is the age of inventions, they said to him, "So, O King, what do you think of all this, eh?"
I feel that I have grown up in a day, so to speak, from the childhood of understanding. I have suddenly sprung to manhood. I shall have a great deal to report to my nation, for which I shall hardly be able to find words, but I have seen the might of England and the goodness and kindness of the English nation.
That he could come up with a statement of reconciliation like this is indeed a magnificent gesture and something which we should all contemplate. He must have been a great character, Cetshwayo, without a doubt. But after Cetshwayo's successful meeting with Queen Victoria, I think it's true to say that she put pressure on Lord Granville, who was then Colonial Secretary, and other ministers to get Cetshwayo back to Zululand. But of course there were complications there. You know, Zululand was carved up into 13 little blocks of territory. Zululand had collapsed into a state of civil war. And this was convenient because divide and rule meant that this energy was expending itself against each other. And in some respects, the civil war continues to this day. But Cetshwayo never really understood why he was invaded. And I think he died without any of those issues having been resolved for him. I think that Cetshwayo was a benign monarch who respected the British and that he was betrayed. it's quite clear to me that it was never intended that the Zulus should submit to the terms of the ultimatum, and it would have been terribly embarrassing for the British if they had. So it was necessary that the ultimatum be issued to the Zulus, the ultimatum expire, the invasion take place, the Zulus be smashed so that they could present the British with a fait accompli before Hicks Beach could stop them.
The aftermath of the Zulu War, I mean, I have seen visible evidence of it.
World-famous conservationist Dr. Ian Player.
The best land was taken by the colonial government, and the Zulus were pushed up into the hills. And consequently, what has happened is that the rivers that once used to flow when I first went to Zululand as rivers are not rivers anymore. They have now become storm drains. And we've had some very bad floods, and all the soil has been washed down into the rivers. The pools have silted up. Where there were crocodiles and hippo, there are no more. Yeah, no, we blotted our copybooks there very badly, and it still goes on. And of course, everybody washed their hands of it. I mean, the history is well known, what Sir Garnet Wolseley did and why he did it. I mean, he did it in order to divide and rule. That was the way at the time. But what has not been done, and this I think is the most important point, the reparations have not really been made.
My great-grandfather, Commander-in-Chief of all the Zulu forces, and my grandfather actually participated in Isandlwana, and one of his brothers died there, and he actually buried him there.
I met Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who is descended from both Cetshwayo and Mnyamana Buthelezi, the Zulu Prime Minister during the Anglo-Zulu War.
Personally, I feel that we cannot be emotionally involved in that. Even if I'm a politician, I always say one cannot be emotionally involved because 100 years ago we're not there, and the British that are living now are not there. But one admires, of course, the bravery of the Zulu people, bravery of people on both sides. There was that mutual admiration, I think, which when we've had joint functions at Isandlwana and place and Rorke Drift actually comes to the surface. You can see that they respect the Zulus because of that history as great warriors and fighters, and we respect also the British as a warrior nation.
The British government was not in favor of conflict with the Zulus. So you have a conflict taking place between two nations that appear to me to have had an affection and respect for each other. And this relationship appears to continue to this day. The irony of the whole of the Zulu War is that these two nations fought each other whilst men on the ground appear to have had a respect for each other. And in the moment of this great victory at Isandlwana, the Zulus sowed the seed of their demise. They also made sure that forever they would be one of the most famous nations that Africa ever produced. And my firm conviction is that the Zulus will always continue to play a vigorous role in South Africa's story.
David Rattray presented that document programme on Rorke's Drift. It was produced by Dawn Ellis with readings by Maynard Eziashi. This programme was the last programme in the document series, which was edited by Richard Bannerman.